technology and products have basically been my life and my career, and I've made some okay and not so okay decisions, and I've spent some time with successful people and companies, and built a few products along the way. And today, I'm hopefully take up the next 15, 20 minutes of your life and kind of walk you through a little bit of this, and at the end, kind of tail off with what we're doing here at Elasticare. I think I should probably preface this with a little bit of an optimist kind of advisory warning. Some of the facts that I make or claims that I will make won't exactly be the popular ones, but hopefully I'll start a little bit of discussion. So if I offend anyone ahead of time, I kind of disclaim that I apologize ahead of time. So, basically, I think healthcare, we kind of read it as a business bias, right? Because it's why we're all here. At the end of the day, we're going to look at it as a product. Because it's an intersection of a lot of different things. It's not only about philanthropy. So intersections basically is where it's at. And we'll talk about kind of the depressing stats and everything and what sucks, but I think it'll help frame what the good stuff can be. And along the way, we'll kind of make some suggestions along the way. So, one of the other things, economics is going to end up topping aesthetics. There are a lot of great looking products out there, but it's not just about, how they look, it's whether they make money or whether they solve concrete problems in a profitably relevant way. Partnerships are an interesting thing because you end up making strange bedfellows along the way. Finally, kind of check yourself in this sense, because what you're trying to do may not necessarily be the thing that's intended. You may end up benefiting a stakeholder that necessarily isn't the intended stakeholder. And be honest, if you're trying to make profit or you're trying to help people, because they're not always the same thing. They're not going to always happen simultaneously. Lastly, Elasticare. What are we doing with that? So, kind of product as an intersection. What does that really mean? So it's, I kind of like to define it, based on what my mentors and my experiences along the way, as something that is surprising yet familiar and delightful. But, basically it's kind of putting all these concepts together. And I highlight these last two words because it kind of serves as the center of our discussion today. And product is classically the motivation. So necessary and acceptable costs, what do those mean? Well, you're going to have to think about that. There's no kind of clear and cut answers for these things. What is an acceptable cost, and who is the target market here? And to profitably solve a relevant problem. Again, define who it's relevant for. Are you trying to sell something to procurement because you want a unicorn, or are you trying to sell something into a patient center because you're trying to make people's lives better? It's not that they're exclusive, but you really have to identify those stakeholders. That's really kind of the thing about design thinking, is going to force you to think about those stakeholders. So typically we tend to look at it like this, where are you calibrated? So the intersection of these areas is needed for a holistic view. So frankly, which is easier over here, the one on the left or the one on the right? I think it's probably the one on the left is a little bit easier because you can just pick one, right? It's not the same as being virtuous at the same time, because if you're trying to make others happy and you're trying to make a practitioner happy, you're not necessarily always going to make profit. The one on the right is harder. Let's acknowledge that. Okay, and if you're asking yourself at this point about ethics and design ethics and about ethics in artificial intelligence and business, you'd be right. This is the time and the place to start questioning this stuff. Okay, so just a quick word on design thinking. I'm not going to rattle off on all this stuff, but it's not about the speeches and gut feels and hip shots. It is a process, and it's not a finality. It does happen to be an iterative process where there are many stakeholders, and execution and inspiration kind of go hand in hand. You really do have to iterate and fail a lot. That doesn't mean you go out there and try to fail, okay? But it does mean you should go out there and spend time with the user and really figure out what works and doesn't. And it's not just in the digital world. Look at kind of analog systems. Ritz-Carlton is a great example of a service product. Okay, they're hotels. Toyota. And there's other caveated products that you have, Uber, Facebook, Google, Amazon. So why caveated? Because, well, that's another rant about why big tech and, anti-innovation, etc. But they're caveated because they also don't necessarily identify the full stakeholders and what can happen along the way when you're talking about innovation. All right, so here's some of the bad choices, along the way when you're trying to do innovation that will become kind of obvious, right? Don't try and, the ones in here that are kind of my favorites, so don't try and science your way out of a bad business model. This happens all the time. It's also why 94% of the digital startups or health startups are going to fail, ultimately. You can't just apply science to a bad business model. If you don't have a profit model, if you don't know what a P&L is, it's going to fail, period. Lack of empathy. Most of you people in here are working in the medical context. You understand the concept of empathy better than probably 99% of the people out there. And I think in that sense, you're much better positioned to be able to create products that matter than the vast majority of people out there. So this is actually a very select audience. You should consider yourself both privileged and kind of in the right company, so to speak. Another one in here is about survivor bias, right? And I talk about it like this. It's like asking a lottery winner, what's your investment strategy? Well, they just played and they won. That's not really an investment strategy. So don't base it based on the unicorns and what you kind of saw off the highlight reel. You're going to have to base it on a whole bunch of knowns and unknowns and look at the stuff that didn't work, even the things that you are not aware of. Okay, so for example, AI judges, we're trying to apply AI everywhere, but a lot of AI is also based these days on survivor bias. Okay, for example, you've got AI judges that are out there in test systems that have prosecuted 9-year-old girls for selling lemonade. Right? Because they're just following the rules. And if AI is just mimicking what we do as human beings, well, they might end up making some pretty terrible choices because we are not the best exemplars of what is virtue out there. So we have to figure out how to bootstrap this information in there. And again, rather than trying to hand wave what AI, and I use that example kind of canonically because it's on the tip of everyone's tongue, you have to be able to explain your business case as well. You have to be able to explain it. Where do you make money? How do you make money? How are you going to do penetration, your market strategy? And we'll talk about that in kind of a second in there. So part of the design thinking, the process intersection in here, okay? So feasible, viable versus desirable. At the end of the day, when we talk about what's feasible and viable, expand your vocabulary in terms of the technical side. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to be data scientists on your own. Just expand your vocabulary. That being said, too, Excel and SQL is not AI. So for you aspiring data scientists out there, people who are hiring that's not really data science. Let's be kind of genuine about that. In terms of what's desirable, you have to get dirty out there. Again, like I said, this is kind of a very privileged and special group. You know that getting down there with patients on the ground and understanding what their use cases are like is really going to help you design a much more empathetic and viable product at the end of the day. Okay, so explain who you're truly helping. If you're talking about viable, look at the business side. Let's use a kind of a counterexample outside healthcare here. If you're talking about things like WeWork, I know everyone's kind of looking at that these days. And Adam Newman's kind of example of, the community-adjusted EBITDA. Don't make up terms like that because that probably is not going to help you end up raising funding at the end of the day, and it's probably going to be hard to explain to an IREB or a research ethics board or your business model or frankly your investors at the end of the day. So viable, there's a bigger message that I'm going to try and leave with you here, which is to try and partner because frankly, that's the only way you're going to survive if you're trying to come up with innovative new products. You cannot do this under your own muster. Why? Know your channels and the funnel. Okay, these are the takeaways that I kind of take from here. Try and do things solo and go deep on your own, and where you can't, partner abroad. Okay, and sympathy is better than empathy. So sympathy is really you being able to experience that firsthand, rather than just acknowledging something in an empathetic sense. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour here and kind of go into something about stats here. Why do I talk about social? So this is the social spend in here. By next CAGR, we're getting 4.5% growth. Why social? Because it's where we spend an increasing amount of our time. And effectively, it's also where we get most of our info. Okay, so the proof, there's many proofs out there. It's in the US election results and flat earthers, the fact that they exist. Also, it's where we get our truth. So where it matters is if you intend to make money, you're going to have to tap into these channels. It doesn't necessarily mean you promote everything on Facebook, but acknowledge that there's a channel out there which is defining people's truth. And it's not just by saying, well, I need to take a ride down a hospital road, and that's where I'm going to get my truth. People communicate on social channels, so therefore that pipeline is where you need to tap in if you're going to be able to innovate. Okay. At the end of the day, these are the companies that are serving that. This is just a social spend. Okay, between these companies. So these are the big aggregators of what is actually being purchased out there. And where's the pipeline coming from? These companies out here. They're the arbiters of truth. They're the ones who are defining what matters. If you're not within the first page, you're not relevant. So how do you become on the first page? You really got to get out there and be mentioned, be talked about. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to have an Instagram account, but you might need to understand what communities are most relevant. And frankly, why does this all matter? Because they have the ability to penetrate and hold captive a very hungry and frankly angry market, especially in healthcare. In other words, it's about funnel. So the parlance of design thinking, while I may be inspired to kind of ideate and implement, you should want to, the business, the kind of the Porter score for the healthcare segment for a startup should kind of make you want to run for the hills. Just as a segue, by the way, Amazon's profits of $10 billion on revenues of $236 billion, by the way, don't sound like a lot, but realize that's effectively a proxy for a dumping strategy in the market. Okay, so head fakes, by the way, by Amazon will kill an entire industry. When they tried to enter the healthcare market, when they announced it, it wiped $30 billion off the healthcare kind of the index. $30 billion just with a head fake. They just announced it. So why am I raising all of this? Is it because it's going to affect what's viable? So this isn't just design in terms of aesthetics. Again, warning ahead of time, right? So this is what our funnel looks like these days. It's not really a funnel. It kind of looks like a keg. Okay, so the biggest purchaser of a funnel for products is Amazon out there by 2 orders of magnitude. It's also the third highest in terms of ad spend. And in, I think, 2024, it'll probably end up outranking Facebook as well. Okay, so they effectively determine the facts. And they have deep pockets to be able to penetrate these markets. So these are probably people you want to partner with. So they have an entire end-to-end value providing chain. It's a dichotomy of what I like to call hyper-local global monopsonies and monopolies. That's a big mouthful, but they are really, really powerful. They are single buyers and they're single sellers. And unless you have deep pockets to be able to support you to get out of there global, you're going to have a hard time getting out there. So partners, stand on the shoulders of giants. So the other entrants in there, well, look at this one. I like scarymommy.com. I think I misspelled that, maybe Scary Mommy, but yeah, plenty of scarred moms out there. But Reddit, Overflow for the angry ones out there, Stack Overflow for the ones who are trying to code your better health and the quantified ones amongst you, and the one that has probably kept me up more nights than I care to admit is WebMD. I know I shouldn't be leaving that, kind of reading that thing about that mole on my back, but guess what? That's what happens. Other entrants who own the brick and mortars are also in this field in the US. You've got your CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid. These are the people who really own your analog footprint. You want to try and establish partnerships with these people for distribution at the end of the day, because it's not like you just stick up a web page. Frankly, if you code it, they don't come. You have to figure out how to get down to the analog space out there. Who proved that? Apple. Everyone thought Jobs was a lunatic for starting that space, but guess what? It really works, right? Experience is where it's at. So my point isn't necessarily to get on Instagram, but it's trying to figure out what's going on Scary Mommy and what's going on WebMD, because that's probably going to inform your choices of penetration and your partnerships at the end of the day. Okay, so rather than looking at that as funnel, really look at that as distribution and access at the end of the day. So what am I saying? Eyeballs and presence are where it's at, and rather than have these brand monopolies, what you're going to look at is value monogamies in that sense, right? It's kind of like the death of brand, but really it's going to come down to 2 or 3 brands out there that are going to provide you a whole amount of value. And so that's going to result in a lot of lunch stealing at the end of the day. So the path to easiest pain relief is going to be partnerships at the end of the day. Okay, so what I think, and here's a prediction, voice is going to become a very important factor in health. It is, because it's probably going to be the next big thing. It's going to be in everyone's homes. And what I suspect is that Amazon and Google will loss lead their way into ubiquity. So while Apple might control the phones of the rich and the well-heeled, it's probably Google that'll end up dominating, because they've got Nest, they've got all these other affordable devices that are out there. They're going to be able to listen and serve that. And Amazon's got the deep pockets, and this is going back to that little analysis on their EBITDA there, they can end up loss leading their way and effectively dumping their way into your life. You probably at some point want to consider how you're going to create an app for Alexa or Amazon to be able to listen to what people are saying or their complaints, and how do you serve them better. Hey Alexa, tell me when my next checkup is, or if it talks back to you in that sense. That's really, provided big tech isn't broken up, this is who you probably want to partner with. And that ecosystem is out there. Okay. Now, why do I bring up this slide? Is because it's going to affect your pricing. Now, in the US, 48% of people who've experienced medical bankruptcy have named hospital bills, and 62.1% of them who filed for it ended up citing, for example, caretaking, or they couldn't attend a diagnostic to be able to look after themselves. And so amongst those medical problems, for example, 10% of them are for bills of $500 or less. So rather than charging outright, you probably have to figure out something like an as-a-service model, or partnering with someone who can take the care to them, especially on the diagnostic side. Rather than waiting for a really expensive exacerbation, and until they come in presenting with just acute symptoms or they're on a gurney, don't wait for that. Try and go out there and prevent proactively. Bottom line, pricing matters. That's why things need to be really as a service. So get the recurring revenue for a higher EBITDA, or better yet, a revenue multiplier for your valuation of your company. It'll help you get bought out a lot faster. So take the water to the horses. I think that's a takeaway from here. So the design intersections at play. Why do I bring this up? Okay, this is the shameless plug. I'm going to come here and try to give you some of the lessons we've learned here at Elasticare. Is this going to become the next unicorn? I have no idea. I have probably a 94% chance of failing at this thing, but I'm probably going to try. And so the specs that we've taken away from here. Elasticare happens to be a cardiac and biometric diagnosis and kind of a telemedicine platform. Okay, so what we're trying to do is understand that the cardiac cluster in terms of diseases kills 17 million people a year, not including or counting the disease cluster with deaths from things like diabetes, COPD, blood pressure, and intestinal-related precursors to heart disease. Why do I talk about that? Yes, there is some interesting data about inflammation. It's related to heart disease. So, a lot of deaths and costs in the cluster basic can be reduced, and profitably so. This is our belief. And for those who are wondering, GTM, the go-to-market for why do I call them big boys? Well, because that kind of is how big tech is acting these days. But again, that's another rant altogether. Here are the metrics that basically our app tries to look for. Okay, we're trying to look for things like waiting time. Yes, waiting time really does suck. Why? Because it kills you. In the past 5 years, I've had 3 friends pass away from basically diseases that were not diagnosed in time. 1 from a heart attack and 2 from cancer. So, yeah, there are a lot of personal stories in here for me. I've had to go through the system myself, and I had to go to the States to get diagnosed. Yes, as much of a patriot as I am, I do have to acknowledge in here in Canada, penetrating the market is tremendously hard, and waiting does suck. I'd frankly be dead if I hadn't gone to the US. You probably want to cut that out of your video feed or the recording at our friends at Digital Health Canada. Yay, Canada, go vote today. Turnaround time, seriously. Okay, cognitive burden. Who likes reading a 70-page report? No one does. If you can reduce the cognitive burden on the cardiologist from 60 minutes down to 60 seconds so they can prioritize and triage you, that's much better. Why? Because we spent time, and this is where I talk about ethnography and design thinking, get on the ground with people. Don't make assumptions that because your engineers are really awesome and they've got a PhD that they know what's best for the patient or how patients work. They don't. You do. If you're a practitioner, go and force them to adapt it to your workflow and be forcible. Like really be outright and outspoken on that side. Okay, so on the segmentation side, by the way, there are people who are wondering why the big 5 over here. So the big 5 in psychology, by the way, we've also shaped our product with psychologists here because there are patterns. So depending on your age, it'll also help with your pricing and go-to-market strategy. Okay, so the perennial kind of the CSAT KPIs really are faster, cheaper, and more. So you combine that with taking the product to the customer, you'll ultimately end up prevailing. So kind of in the pyramid of access over here, we're trying to go somewhere in between because you're going to have to find the best balance. And I'd probably encourage those companies here who are innovating, if you don't have institutional support, and if you are not supported by an incubator that's a bank or a hospital right now that's got billions under its belt, you're probably going to have to figure out how to penetrate the market if you're not able to go at the top. At the top, you've got these great golden handcuffs, but at the bottom, you've got the ability to go to heart and to the customer. And that's where I talk about, penetration is easy, but doesn't mean that conquest is easy. It's easy to get in there, but that's where partnerships kind of matter. And it's going to be up to you to figure out where in this pyramid here or this triangle in here that it makes most sense for you to have your alliances and your partnerships so to penetrate the market. Again, so this speaks to the intersection between feasible, desirable, and valuable. Okay. So lastly, I'll kind of carry on with a little bit of a shameless plug about our system over here. This is what our system actually looks like, right? So it's the world's smallest 12-lead ECG. It took a lot of sleepless nights to be able to get it into something that was that small. 6 and 12-lead ECG, why? Because we want to get a full picture of the heart. And we don't want to end up going back every 6 to 12 weeks. So rather than having that periodic analysis, we want to have that continued analysis. Get the people out of the hospital or out of the diagnostic centers back home, get that continual monitoring, and make apps like this easy to use. If you're wondering why this looks like an IKEA manual, that's no surprise. That's very intentional. We've tried to make it easy for nurses and nurse practitioners and patients to make it very easy to understand and use. Again, it's about that metric, about cognitive burden, and lowering that time to understanding and goal achievement. And when we talk about things like third-party device integration, that talks to things like the disease cluster, right? So BP cuffs, glucometers, etc. Those are all going to help you diagnose things within your cardiac disease cluster in there. So right now we're in the midst of clinical trials, pending Q1 2020 for our FDA approval, hoping to get out there. Strangely enough, our biggest market where we've got people lining up right now does not happen in Canada or the United States. It happens to be in India and then some countries out in East Africa. Because just the size of the market we have over there exceeds the entire population of Canada. As much as I'm a patriot, at the end of the day, that little intersection part of viable and profitable for me means I still need to be able to have a runway. So eventually, yes, we do want to bring the the product back to Canada. But right now, we're going to be starting internationally. Once we get enough runway, we'll come back here to Canada. Again, yay Canada, go vote. So thank you. I know I've been kind of blasting through this stuff at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Got a limited amount of time. Second shameless plug, you guys need help on this type of process or want to know more about these facts or claims, come and talk to me. Best of luck. And remember, if business isn't an art, it's not really about design, it's about discipline and structure. So, check yourself and, stay woke. Thank you.